There is a version of World War I that most people carry in their heads without ever examining it too closely. It involves mud and barbed wire, generals with mustaches, soldiers going over the top while a bugle plays somewhere in the distance. It involves sacrifice and tragedy, but tragedy with a shape to it, tragedy that eventually ends, tragedy that gets carved into stone monuments and read aloud on certain mornings in November. That version of the war is not entirely false, but it is carefully incomplete. It leaves out the parts that do not fit on monuments. It skips over the routines, the daily mechanical operations of mass death that were not dramatic, not heroic, not even particularly violent in any singular memorable sense, but simply ongoing, simply normal, simply the way things were done between 1914 and 1918 across thousands of miles of churned European earth. What actually happened in World War I, stripped of the ceremony that was layered over it almost immediately after it ended, was the construction of an industrial system for processing human beings. Not metaphorically, not as a rhetorical flourish. Literally, an industrial system with supply chains and production quotas and administrative protocols, with paperwork filed in triplicate and bureaucratic categories for every conceivable form of damage that could be done to a human body or mind. The war had a logic to it, not the logic of honor or necessity or even strategy in any meaningful sense, but the logic of an institution that had been set in motion and did not know how to stop, and had, over the course of 4 years, developed internal routines so normalized, so embedded in daily practice, that the people operating within the system largely ceased to register what those routines were actually accomplishing. This video is about those routines, not the famous battles, not the famous names, not the diplomatic failures that preceded the war, or the treaty provisions that arguably extended its consequences. This is about what soldiers and medical officers and supply clerks and trench diggers and burial parties actually did from day to day. What was asked of them, what was recorded about them, what was quietly suppressed when it became too difficult to explain to civilians, and what researchers have spent decades recovering from archives that were sealed, misfiled, or simply never meant to be read. 24 routines. 24 practices that were not accidents or aberrations but standard operating procedure. 24 things that happened regularly enough that the military institutions of Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the United States developed formal or informal systems for handling them. Some of these routines were physical, some were administrative, some existed entirely on paper, which in a certain way made them more disturbing because paper outlasts the people it describes, and reading through those files now, in climate-controlled archives far from any trench, you can feel the deliberate distance the language was designed to create. The first routine that shocks researchers is so elementary, so foundational to the entire structure of trench warfare, that it is easy to overlook what it actually required of human beings. Every single day, in every sector of the Western Front and across most other active fronts, soldiers were required to stand at the edge of their trench before dawn and stare into darkness for an extended period while being actively shot at. This was called the morning stand too. It happened at first light, when visibility was low enough that an attacking force could potentially advance undetected, and it required every man in the trench to be awake, armed, and exposed at the parapet for anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the sector and the season. This was not optional. This was not rotated among volunteers. Every man stood, every morning, for the duration of his time in the line. The psychological literature on what this does to human beings is extensive, though most of it was written decades after the war by researchers working backward from veteran testimonies. What it does, in simple terms, is train the nervous system to associate dawn with threat, to associate the transition from darkness to light with the imminence of death. After weeks of stand-to, many soldiers reported that they could no longer watch a sunrise without experiencing what later researchers would recognize as acute anxiety responses. They could not separate the aesthetic fact of morning light from the bodily memory of standing at a parapet, waiting to be shot. This conditioning did not end when the war ended. Veterans carried it home. Their families noticed that they woke early and became agitated. Their physicians, who had no framework for understanding what had been done to these men's nervous systems, prescribed rest and recommended they avoid dwelling on the past. The morning stand too was followed, in most British and French sectors, by a systematic inspection of weapons, ammunition, and the trench structure itself. This inspection was not cursory. Officers were required to examine each man's rifle, to ensure it had not been fouled overnight by the mud and water that constantly infiltrated the trenches. The mud of Flanders in particular had a consistency and a chemistry that was uniquely destructive to metal. It worked its way into firing mechanisms and caused misfires. It corroded metal over the course of days. The standard approach to this problem was daily cleaning, which required soldiers to spend part of every morning in a cramped trench position, attempting to clean precision instruments with limited cleaning materials, inadequate light, and hands that in winter were often too cold to feel what they were doing. The records show that disciplinary actions for uncleaned weapons were common, and that soldiers were punished for equipment failures caused directly by the conditions their commanding officers had placed them in. This was a pattern that recurred throughout the institutional life of the war. The conditions created the problem. The institution then punished the soldier for the problem the conditions created. This was not understood as contradictory by most of the officers administering discipline because they were operating within a framework that treated soldier performance as a matter of individual will rather than material circumstance. If your rifle was dirty, you had failed in your duty. The fact that your rifle was dirty because you had been standing in cold water for 16 hours was not recorded as a mitigating factor in most disciplinary proceedings. The second routine involves the management of the dead, which in World War I became a logistical operation of a scale and complexity that had no precedent in military history. The problem of dead bodies in and around trenches was not a peripheral issue. It was a central operational challenge that affected sanitation, morale, supply movement, and the fundamental structure of the trench system itself. In many sectors, particularly after major offensives, the number of unburied dead was so large that it fundamentally altered the physical landscape. Bodies decomposed into the soil. In some areas of the Somme and Verdun, the earth was composed partly of human remains, a fact that soldiers were aware of and that medical officers documented in reports that were subsequently classified or minimized before reaching the press. The burial routine in quieter periods was assigned to specific parties, usually working at night to avoid observation and sniper fire. Burial parties were not volunteers. They were assigned by roster, rotated through the available men, and expected to perform the work with the same professional detachment as any other military task. The documentation of burial work in regimental diaries is remarkably consistent in its tone. The number of bodies collected is recorded in the same handwriting, with the same administrative language as the number of ammunition rounds expended or the quantity of rations received. The work itself is rarely described in any detail. What is described, when anything beyond the numbers is recorded at all, is the difficulty of the terrain or the weather conditions, not the content of what was being handled. What burial parties actually encountered, and what researchers have recovered from private letters and from the testimony of veterans collected in the 1970s and 1980s, was categorically unlike anything the men had been prepared for. Bodies in the advanced stages of decomposition in warm weather. Bodies partially buried under shell debris that had to be excavated before they could be moved. Bodies that had been so thoroughly disrupted by explosive force that the question of individual identity was not merely difficult, but sometimes geometrically impossible. The standard practice in such cases was to collect what could be collected and record it as unknown. The administrative category of unknown became one of the most significant documentary categories of the entire war. By the armistice, hundreds of thousands of men had been reduced to administrative unknowns, their individual deaths absorbed into a collective accounting system that could record the loss without identifying it. The families of these men received forms, standard forms, printed in quantity with blanks filled in by clerks who had never met the men they were writing about. The forms stated that the soldier had died for his country. They did not describe what had happened. In many cases, the letters sent to families contained information that had been specifically formulated to be reassuring rather than accurate, a practice that was not accidental but deliberate, coordinated at the level of regimental and divisional command, part of an explicit policy of managing civilian morale through the careful management of information about how soldiers were actually dying. The third routine is the rotation system itself, the way men were cycled in and out of the front line, which sounds on paper like a humane arrangement and in practice was something considerably different. The standard rotation in the British Army moved men from the front trench to support positions to reserve positions, and then to rest billets, with each phase lasting a certain number of days and the entire cycle repeating continuously for the duration of a soldier's time at the front. Rest billets were usually damaged civilian structures several miles behind the line, close enough that artillery fire was frequently audible and occasionally close enough that it was lethal. The word rest was used in the military sense, meaning not currently assigned to frontline duty, and should not be confused with the civilian sense, which implies recovery, sleep, and the restoration of physical and psychological resources. During rest periods, soldiers were assigned to working parties. They carried supplies. They dug new trenches or repaired existing ones. They laid wire. They performed the maintenance work that kept the physical infrastructure of the front functioning. This work was often performed at night to avoid enemy observation, which meant that the rest period involved being awake and performing hard physical labor during the hours when the human body is biologically programmed to sleep. The cumulative sleep deprivation experienced by frontline soldiers over extended periods was documented by military medical officers who noted, with some consistency, that the men they were examining displayed cognitive impairments, emotional dysregulation, and a range of physical symptoms that correlated with extended sleep disruption. These observations were filed. They influenced almost nothing about how the rotation system operated. The fourth routine is the management of water. In the trenches of the Western Front, particularly in the low-lying ground of Flanders, water was simultaneously everywhere and scarce. The groundwater that flooded the trenches was not drinkable. The water that soldiers needed to drink had to be brought forward from sources behind the line in containers, typically by carrying parties moving at night over ground that was under intermittent fire. The daily water ration varied by sector and by the efficiency of the supply chain, but it was routinely inadequate for the combination of physical labor and psychological stress that soldiers were experiencing. Dehydration was chronic. This is documented in medical records, in regimental diaries, in the private letters that pass through military censors. The censorship of those letters is itself a routine worth examining. Every letter written by a soldier in the British Army was subject to examination by an officer before it was sent. The officer, often a junior lieutenant who had his own duties and his own letters to write, was expected to read each letter and redact any information that could be useful to the enemy or damaging to morale. In practice, this meant that soldiers could not tell their families the truth about where they were, what the conditions were like, or what they had witnessed. They developed a coded vocabulary, a set of euphemisms and understatements that their families sometimes understood and sometimes did not. The letters that survive in archives are extraordinary documents, not because of what they say, but because of the visible pressure of what they are not saying. The sentences that stop before they finish. The observations that are made and then immediately qualified into near meaninglessness. The censorship system created a documented record of institutional suppression that researchers have been working through for decades. What emerges from that work is a picture of an institution that was aware, at every level of command, of the gap between the official narrative of the war and what was actually happening to soldiers' bodies and minds, and that chose consistently and deliberately to maintain that gap. This was not individual dishonesty. It was systemic. It was policy. It was a routine. The fifth routine involves lice. This seems like a minor thing. It is not. Lice infestation was nearly universal among frontline troops across all armies throughout the war. It was not a sign of individual uncleanliness. It was structurally unavoidable given the conditions. Men living in confined spaces without access to bathing facilities, wearing the same clothes for extended periods, sleeping in dugouts that harbored the parasites in their walls and floors. The British Army gave lice a name. They called them chats. The act of searching for and removing lice became a social activity conducted during rest periods, men sitting together and going through each other's clothing with the same routine sociability as any other communal task. What lice meant beyond the itching and the disruption to sleep was a constant physical reminder that the soldier's body had become part of an environment he could not control and could not clean himself of. Medical officers tracked louse-borne diseases, particularly trench fever, which caused fevers, severe pain, and incapacitation for weeks at a time, and was responsible for a significant portion of the non-combat casualties across the Western Front. The bacterium responsible for trench fever was not identified until 1918. For most of the war, soldiers who developed it were categorized in ways that did not always accurately reflect the cause of their illness, which complicated the statistical record and made it harder for historians to reconstruct the full medical picture of the conflict. The sixth routine is so well known that it has been almost entirely abstracted from its physical reality: gas attacks. Not the dramatic sudden attack which happened, but the routine daily presence of chemical agents in the air and soil of the front. After the first large-scale use of chlorine in April 1915 and the subsequent introduction of phosgene, mustard gas, and other agents, the management of chemical hazard became a continuous operational concern, not a crisis, but a background condition. Soldiers were issued gas masks. They were trained to put them on rapidly. They carried the masks at all times. The masks were uncomfortable, restricted vision, made communication difficult, and created their own physical stress when worn for extended periods. The introduction of mustard gas in 1917 changed the nature of the chemical threat in a way that is difficult to overstate. Unlike earlier gases that were primarily respiratory threats, mustard gas was a persistent blistering agent that contaminated surfaces, clothing, and soil for days after deployment. It caused severe blistering to any exposed skin, eyes, and respiratory tissue. It could be absorbed through clothing. Its characteristic odor, a faint smell sometimes described as garlic or mustard, became one of the most feared sensory signals in the environment of the trench. Medical records from 1917 onward document a massive increase in the percentage of casualties attributable to gas, and the care required for gas casualties, particularly mustard gas casualties, was extraordinarily resource-intensive. Men blinded, men with severely blistered skin requiring constant wound management, men with damaged airways who needed ongoing respiratory support. These cases filled aid stations and base hospitals at a rate that strained the medical system and was documented extensively in reports that were not made public during the war. The seventh routine involves the medical triage system, which is now recognized as one of the most significant administrative developments of the conflict and which at the time was one of the clearest expressions of the institutional logic of mass warfare. Triage, as developed and systematized during World War I, is the practice of sorting casualties into categories based on the likelihood that treatment will produce a survivable and militarily useful outcome. The categories, which varied slightly across different armies, were roughly equivalent to those who could be treated and returned to duty quickly, those who needed extensive treatment but might survive, and those for whom treatment would not affect the outcome. The third category received palliative care at most. This is a rational system for managing medical resources under conditions of mass casualty. The military medical officers who developed and implemented it were not callous individuals. Most of them were, by any reasonable measure, working under impossible conditions with inadequate resources and making difficult decisions in good faith. The point is not the individuals. The point is the system. The point is that the triage system, which became the standard approach to mass casualty management, is an institutional expression of the idea that the usefulness of a human life can be calculated and ranked, and that this calculation should determine what resources are allocated to preserving it. This idea did not originate with World War I, but World War I industrialized it, systematized it, applied it at scale across millions of casualties over 4 years, and in doing so normalized a way of thinking about human life that had not previously existed in institutionalized form at that scale. The 8th routine is the practice of executing soldiers for military offenses, particularly desertion and cowardice, which in the British Army resulted in over 300 confirmed executions, and which in the French Army reached crisis proportions during the mutinies of 1917. The execution of soldiers was not unusual or anomalous in any military context of the time. It was a standard element of military law. What was unusual about World War I was the combination of scale, the industrial quantity of men being processed through the system, and the specific nature of the offenses being prosecuted. A large proportion of the men executed for desertion or cowardice were, by any reasonable modern assessment, suffering from severe psychological trauma. Shell shock, as it was called at the time, or what would now be recognized as combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder, caused exactly the behaviors that military law defined as desertion and cowardice. Flight from the front line, inability to follow orders, physical paralysis or uncontrollable trembling, failure to function as a soldier. The British military medical establishment was aware of this. There were doctors, particularly W.H.R. Rivers and Charles Myers, who argued explicitly that shell shock was a medical condition, not a moral failing, and that men suffering from it required treatment rather than punishment. These arguments had some influence on policy over the course of the war. They did not prevent the executions. Men who were almost certainly suffering from severe psychological injury were shot by firing squads composed of their fellow soldiers, many of whom were themselves traumatized, following proceedings that were often summary, inadequately documented, and conducted without the legal representation that the accused would theoretically have been entitled to. The records of many of these proceedings were maintained, but not made publicly accessible until decades after the war, and the full accounting of what happened and under what conditions is still being assembled by researchers. The 9th routine is the use of gas as a weapon, but specifically the routine of sending men into areas that had been gassed shortly before and were still contaminated, because the operational schedule required it. The persistence of mustard gas in particular meant that ground that had been attacked with it remained hazardous for days. Military objectives did not always allow for waiting out the contamination. Commanders ordered advances across contaminated ground. Soldiers moved through areas where the soil itself could cause severe chemical burns. The records show that commanders were aware of the contamination and ordered advances anyway. The records also show that the casualties from these advances were documented, absorbed into the statistical flow of the war, and did not typically trigger significant changes in operational planning. The next advance was ordered. The next set of casualties was documented. The system continued. The 10th routine is the maintenance of the wire. Barbed wire was one of the defining features of the Western Front landscape, and its maintenance was a continuous operation that required dedicated labor under dangerous conditions. Wire parties went out at night into no man's land to repair damaged sections of wire, extend existing lines, or cut through enemy wire in preparation for raids or attacks. These parties worked in darkness, by feel, with equipment that was not designed for quiet operation. The sound of wire being cut or placed could attract fire. Men on wire parties were killed and wounded regularly enough that the task was rotated through available personnel on a schedule similar to other hazardous duties. The bodies of men killed on wire parties sometimes remained in no man's land for extended periods because the conditions did not permit recovery. This was documented. The sight and later the smell of unrecovered bodies in no man's land was a constant feature of the trench experience for men in sectors where recent fighting had occurred. Medical officers noted that prolonged exposure to the smell of decomposing bodies had psychological effects that they struggled to characterize with the vocabulary available to them. The language of moral resilience, which was the dominant framework for understanding soldier psychology in the early years of the war, was increasingly inadequate to describe what officers were observing. But the institutional systems for documenting and responding to these observations developed slowly and unevenly. The 11th routine involves the management of what the British Army called wastage, which was the term used in official documents to describe the ongoing non-battle losses of manpower due to illness, injury, psychiatric breakdown, and administrative attrition. Wastage was a budget item. It was calculated, projected, and tracked with the same administrative machinery used to track ammunition expenditure or ration consumption. The term itself is significant. Wastage, not loss, not death, not destruction. Wastage, as in the normal and expected erosion of a material during use, the way sandpaper wears down, the way a tool dulls with use. The men being described by this term were not present in the documents as individuals. They were units of military capacity, and their reduction from the available pool was budgeted for in advance because the institution knew, with the precision of accumulated experience, approximately how many men would be rendered non-functional per unit of time in a given sector under given operational conditions. The precision of this knowledge is itself remarkable. By the middle years of the war, the British Army had developed actuarial quality estimates of wastage rates across different types of units and operational conditions. They knew approximately how many men would become non-functional per day in a quiet sector. They knew approximately how many would be lost per 100 yards of advance in a major offensive. This knowledge was used to calculate replacement requirements, to schedule the movement of reinforcements from training depots to the front, to maintain the flow of men through the system at the rate required to sustain operations. The system was not chaotic, it was organized, it was managed. It knew what it was doing to the people flowing through it, and it planned accordingly. The 12th routine involves the role of military chaplains, not in the conventional sense of providing spiritual comfort, but as a component of the administrative system for managing soldier psychology and maintaining unit cohesion. Chaplains in the British Army were attached to military units and were expected to perform a range of functions that went well beyond the religious. They were expected to be present at aid stations and clearing stations during casualty operations, to speak with wounded and dying men, to write letters to families on behalf of men who could no longer write for themselves, and to participate in the management of unit morale by maintaining soldier confidence in the justice of the war and the meaning of the sacrifice being asked of them. The diaries and memoirs of chaplains who served on the Western Front constitute one of the most revealing documentary records of the conflict, precisely because chaplains occupied an unusual institutional position. They had access to what soldiers actually said and felt, without the same obligation to filter and report that characterized the relationship between soldiers and their commanding officers. What chaplains recorded was a progressive, systematic, and ultimately catastrophic collapse of the belief system that was supposed to sustain soldiers through the experience of industrial warfare. The narrative that had been constructed to explain and justify the war, the narrative of duty, sacrifice, national purpose, and divine sanction, encountered the reality of the front and was, for many soldiers, destroyed by it. The chaplains watched this happen. They documented it. The documentation was not hidden exactly, but it was not prominently featured in the official accounts of the war that were produced during and immediately after the conflict. The 13th routine involves the food supply, not the dramatic failures of supply that sometimes left soldiers without rations for extended periods during intense fighting, but the ordinary daily reality of frontline nutrition. The caloric content of the standard British frontline ration was, on paper, adequate. In practice, the food that reached frontline soldiers was often cold, partially contaminated, and nutritionally compromised by the conditions of storage and transport. Tinned bully beef, army biscuits that were hard enough to cause dental damage, Tea that was the primary hot beverage and was made with water of variable quality, occasionally supplemented by items purchased from local sources when available. This diet was maintained for months, for years, for men who were simultaneously performing heavy physical labor and experiencing chronic physiological stress. The nutritional deficiencies that developed in some sectors and under some conditions were documented by medical officers who observed the physical consequences: weight loss, dental deterioration, vitamin deficiency symptoms, impaired wound healing. These observations were filed. Ration specifications were occasionally adjusted in response to documented deficiencies. The fundamental structure of the supply system was not changed, because the fundamental structure of the supply system was constrained by the same logistical realities that constrained everything else about the conduct of the war, and the soldiers at the end of the supply chain received what the system could deliver. The 14th routine is the practice of conducting raids into enemy trenches, which were a regular feature of trench warfare throughout most of the war, and which served a combination of operational and institutional purposes that is worth examining carefully. Raids were presented to soldiers, and to some extent to the public, as aggressive actions that kept the initiative with the attacking side, gathered intelligence, and demonstrated fighting spirit. The actual operational value of most raids was marginal at best. They rarely achieved significant intelligence gains. They did not meaningfully alter the tactical situation. What they did accomplish, with considerable consistency, was producing casualties on both sides and maintaining a posture of offensive activity that commanding officers at various levels felt was necessary to demonstrate to their superiors. The mandatory aggression of the raiding routine was a source of considerable documented tension between frontline soldiers and their officers. The soldiers who actually conducted raids understood that the risks were high and the gains were minimal. The officers who ordered the raids were operating within an institutional framework that evaluated their performance partly on the basis of the offensive activity their units displayed, and which treated passivity, even when tactically rational, as evidence of insufficient fighting spirit. The casualties produced by raids were absorbed into the wastage accounts. The operational gains, when any were achieved, were reported upward. The system continued to require raids. The raids continued to occur. The casualties continued to be recorded. The 15th routine involves the treatment of shell shock, which is the most extensively studied psychological phenomenon of the First World War, and which was managed over the course of the conflict through a series of approaches that collectively constitute one of the most disturbing institutional performances in the history of military medicine. The term shell shock was coined early in the war to describe the cluster of symptoms: tremor, paralysis, mutism, nightmares, extreme startle response, inability to function, that were being observed in increasing numbers of soldiers who had not been physically wounded in any identifiable way. The initial explanatory hypothesis was that the symptoms were caused by the physical effects of nearby explosions on the nervous system, which is where the name came from. As the war progressed and the volume of shell shock cases grew to a scale that represented a significant drain on military manpower, the institutional response evolved through a series of phases that tracked the tension between medical understanding and military necessity. Some physicians argued for humane treatment and genuine medical care. The institution, concerned about both manpower and the potential for shell shock to become a legitimized escape from duty, developed approaches that prioritized rapid return to military function over therapeutic benefit. The forward psychiatry approach, developed partly in response to the observation that men evacuated far from the front recovered less completely than men treated closer to it, can be understood both as a genuine medical innovation and as a system for minimizing the loss of manpower to psychological injury by treating men as close to the source of their trauma as possible and returning them to that source as quickly as possible. The men returned to the line after brief forward treatment were frequently returned before any meaningful recovery had occurred. Medical records document cases of men returned to duty and within days experiencing the same or worse symptoms. The institutional response to these cases was often further discipline rather than further treatment, because the system had used up its classification capacity on the first episode and was now operating in a framework where the continued exhibition of symptoms was increasingly likely to be read as willful behavior rather than medical condition. The 16th routine involves what happened at night in the trenches, not the raids and wire parties that have been documented, but the ordinary experience of darkness in a combat environment, which was a sensory and psychological condition without civilian equivalent. The Western Front was never truly dark in the modern sense. Flares went up regularly from both sides, illuminating no man's land for seconds at a time with a cold white light that cast sharp shadows and revealed any movement to waiting observers. Snipers operated at night as well as in the day, and the sound of a flare going up triggered an immediate trained response. Freeze, do not move, become still until the light died. For men standing watch in the trenches, this cycle of darkness and sudden illumination continued throughout the night, every night, for the duration of their time in the line. The freezing response to flares, the alertness to sound, the trained attention to everything that moved or could move in the darkness. These were physiological states that produced measurable effects on the body and the nervous system. Medical officers documenting sleep patterns among frontline soldiers noted that even when men were not on watch and theoretically able to sleep, the trained response to environmental stimuli that had been developed for survival in the trenches made continuous sleep nearly impossible. The light-sensitive startle responses, the waking at sounds, the inability to achieve the relaxation of attention necessary for deep sleep, these were not psychological disorders in the conventional sense. They were adaptations, functional adaptations to a specific environment. They were also, when those men returned to civilian life and the environment changed, deeply dysfunctional. The 17th routine involves the management of prisoners of war, specifically the immediate handling of prisoners taken during raids and offensives, which deviated in documented ways from the formal provisions of the Hague Conventions that nominally governed the treatment of captured combatants. Prisoners taken during the confusion of an offensive or a raid were in a significantly more dangerous position than the formal legal framework suggested. In the chaos of an assault, prisoners could not always be escorted to the rear immediately, and in some documented cases, men who had surrendered were killed rather than taken, either because escort was impossible under the tactical conditions, or because the men doing the capturing had experienced losses in the assault that had produced an emotional state incompatible with prisoner management. This happened. It was documented in private letters, in some regimental histories, in testimony collected decades later. It was not systematically recorded in official documents because the official records of prisoner handling focused on the downstream process, the interrogation and registration systems that operated at division and corps level, not the immediate chaos of capture. The gap between the formal legal framework and the documented reality was one of many such gaps in the official record of the war, and it was maintained by an institutional culture that treated certain categories of information as inappropriate for the official record, even when they were well known to the people creating that record. The 18th routine is the systematic collection and analysis of intelligence from the front, which involved, among other things, the long-term observation of enemy positions, the interception and analysis of communications, and the use of aerial reconnaissance, which was one of the genuinely new military technologies of the conflict. What is less frequently discussed is the intelligence routine that operated at the level of the individual soldier. The collection of identity documents, unit insignia, and other materials from dead enemy soldiers as a standard part of offensive operations. Burial parties and soldiers following up after engagements were expected to remove and forward identifying materials from enemy dead, which would be analyzed to determine which enemy units were present in a given sector and what changes in the order of battle could be inferred from their movement. The men performing this task were handling the personal effects of men they had recently been trying to kill, and who in many cases had recently been trying to kill them. The institutional framework for this task was entirely practical. Collect identifiers, forward them, receive credit for useful intelligence. The human reality of going through the pockets of a dead enemy soldier and removing his documents and personal photographs while standing in a shell-damaged landscape surrounded by the other dead was not addressed by the institutional framework because the institutional framework was not designed to address it. The men did the work. The documents moved up the intelligence chain. The personal items that had no intelligence value were sometimes kept and sometimes discarded and sometimes buried with the body. This varied by individual. There was no formal protocol for the personal items because the institutional logic had no category for them. The 19th routine involves the regular inspection of soldiers for venereal disease, which became one of the significant public health challenges of the war, and which was managed through a combination of medical surveillance, moralizing institutional discourse, and pragmatic harm reduction that reflected the deep contradictions in how military institutions thought about soldier sexuality. Venereal disease rates in World War I armies were substantial. The British Army, despite considerable institutional effort to suppress the activity that produced them, documented hundreds of thousands of cases of gonorrhea and syphilis across the 4 years of the war. The treatment of these cases consumed significant medical resources, removed men from active duty for extended periods, and generated a body of administrative and medical documentation that historians have found revealing about both the conditions of the war and the institutional attitudes toward the men fighting it. The official discourse around venereal disease was heavily moralistic. Soldiers were expected to maintain sexual continence. The disease was framed as a consequence of moral failing, and men who contracted it were, in some periods and some sectors, subject to forfeiture of pay during their treatment on the grounds that they had voluntarily incapacitated themselves. The practical medical response, which recognized that sexual activity by men under extreme stress was not going to be eliminated by moral exhortation, was more pragmatic and included the provision of prophylactic materials and the operation of regulated venues in some rear areas. The tension between these two approaches was never resolved because it reflected a deeper unresolved tension in how the military institution conceptualized the men it was using. Were they moral agents whose behavior should reflect the values of the civilization they were supposedly defending? Or were they biological entities whose functioning needed to be maintained at an adequate level for operational purposes? The 20th routine is the practice of keeping operational units at the front beyond the point at which they retained any meaningful military effectiveness, because the replacement and rotation systems could not always supply fresh units at the rate that the operational schedule required. The measurement of unit effectiveness was imprecise and frequently overridden by operational necessity. Commanding officers who reported that their units were no longer effective were sometimes replaced rather than having their units rested, because the institutional culture treated such reports as evidence of inadequate leadership rather than accurate operational assessment. This created a documented pattern in which units that were no longer capable of sustained offensive action were kept in position and committed to operations that produced casualties without achieving objectives, which further reduced their effectiveness, which was reported upward in terms that underrepresented the reality, which led to further operational commitments that produced further casualties. The documentary evidence of this cycle is extensive in the records of the Somme, Passchendaele, and other major Western Front operations. Regimental diaries that record the steady erosion of unit strength over weeks of continuous operation. Medical records that show increasing proportions of the remaining men presenting with conditions that in any other context would have been considered disqualifying. Casualty returns that document the ongoing production of dead and wounded by units that had long since lost any capacity to achieve the objectives they were assigned. The system knew this was happening. The documents show it. The operations continued. The 21st routine involves the experience of being under artillery bombardment, which was the most common form of combat experienced by soldiers across all armies for most of the war, and which remains, in some ways, the least adequately described experience of the conflict. Small arms fire, the rifle and machine gun engagement, has a spatial logic that the human brain evolved to process. You can identify where fire is coming from, you can take cover, you can in some sense engage with the threat. Artillery bombardment is different in a fundamental way. The shells are fired from locations miles away, are invisible in flight, and arrive without directional warning. Their distribution is determined by ballistic calculations that have nothing to do with the individual soldier's location or behavior. There is no cover that provides reliable protection from a direct hit. There is no action available that meaningfully affects the probability of being struck. The psychological research on this specific form of threat, conducted largely after the war on the basis of veteran testimony and the shell shock case records, found that extended exposure to artillery bombardment produced a distinctive pattern of physiological and psychological response. The helplessness was the critical factor. Human beings under threat can manage fear more effectively when they have agency, when there is something they can do that affects the outcome. Under heavy bombardment, there was nothing to do. Men lay in their positions, in dugouts when available, in open positions when they were not, and waited. They waited while the ground around them was destroyed. They waited while men near them were killed or wounded. They waited for shells that might land on them or might not, and there was nothing in their behavior that changed the probability either way. This experience, repeated across days and weeks and months of life at the front, produced the cluster of symptoms that was called shell shock, and that we would now recognize as the specific signature of inescapable, uncontrollable, prolonged threat. The 20-second routine is the operation of the courts-martial system, which processed an extraordinary volume of cases throughout the war and which, in its documentation, provides one of the most revealing pictures of the institutional management of human behavior under conditions of industrial warfare. The range of offenses prosecuted by courts-martial during the First World War included not only the serious capital offenses like desertion and cowardice, but a vast array of lesser violations. Falling asleep on sentry duty, losing equipment, being absent without leave, insubordination, drunkenness, failing to maintain adequate hygiene, a catalogue of behavioral failures that reflected the institution's attempt to maintain organizational function among men who were experiencing conditions specifically designed to produce exactly those failures. The courts-martial records, when they have been made accessible, are remarkable documents. The testimony of accused soldiers, often brief and poorly transcribed by clerks under time pressure, occasionally breaks through the formal language of the proceedings to reveal the actual conditions being managed. Men explaining that they fell asleep on sentry duty because they had been awake for 36 hours. Men explaining that they left their position because they were in a state of psychological collapse that they could not articulate in terms the court would recognize. Men whose defense was the literal truth of their situation, a truth that the court had no institutional framework for receiving. The sentences handed down in these proceedings were not anomalies. They were the normal output of a system that was functioning as designed. The 23rd routine involves the treatment of the civilian populations of the occupied and combat zones, particularly in Belgium and northern France, which hosted the most intense fighting and which experienced a form of civilian experience that has been somewhat eclipsed by the focus on the military narrative of the war. Civilians in the combat zone lived with the same constant threat of artillery fire, the same landscape of destruction, the same sensory environment of constant noise and chemical contamination, with the additional disorientation of not being part of any military structure that provided either purpose or group cohesion. They simply existed in the war, as they existed in the villages and towns that they could not or would not leave, in basements and in buildings that had been partly destroyed, in a landscape that bore increasingly little resemblance to the one they had inhabited before 1914. The military administrations of all the armies operating in occupied or combat-adjacent areas developed routines for managing civilian populations that ranged from reasonably careful to actively exploitative, depending on the army, the sector, and the period of the war. The requisitioning of civilian food stocks, the use of civilian labor, the movement of civilians out of areas needed for military operations. These were all routine administrative practices documented in the orders and records of military governments and commanding officers. The human experience of being subject to these administrative routines, of having your food taken, your labor commanded, your home requisitioned, was recorded in civilian diaries and in the documentation of humanitarian organizations that operated in the war zones. But it occupied a different documentary world from the military records and has been integrated into the broader historical picture of the war unevenly. The 24th routine is perhaps the most fundamental one of all, because it underlies every other routine described here and makes all of them possible. It is the routine of the morning casualty report, the daily accounting of the human cost of the previous 24 hours, which was compiled at every level of military organization, from the platoon to the army group, and which flowed upward through the administrative hierarchy as a continuous stream of numbers. Every morning, somewhere in France, Belgium, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, East Africa, and every other theater where men were fighting and dying in this war, clerks and officers sat down and compiled the numbers. Dead, so many. Wounded, so many. Missing, so many. Sick, so many. The categories were fixed. The format was standardized. The numbers changed every day in every sector and remained constant in their administrative form. The casualty reports of the First World War, taken together, constitute one of the most extraordinary documentary records in human history, a continuous, unbroken, daily accounting of human death and injury maintained by an institution operating at the scale of an industrial economy. The cumulative totals are well known. Approximately 17 million dead, 21 million wounded. These numbers are cited regularly and have been for a century, which has, in a certain sense, done to them what the morning casualty reports were doing in real time: abstracted them, given them an administrative form that maintains the fact while removing the content. Behind each number in those reports was a specific human body in a specific condition in a specific location. The numbers were generated by a system, and the system generated them routinely, systematically, every day for 4 years, and absorbed the results into its operational planning, and ordered the next day's operations, and the next morning the reports came in again, and the numbers were a little different, and the system noted the difference and adjusted its projections and continued. The war ended not because the system that had produced this daily accounting found a reason to stop, but because the material resources available to sustain it were exhausted. The last morning casualty report was filed on November 11, 1918. The format was the same as every previous report. The categories were the same. The numbers on that last morning were non-trivial.